Hey, what's going on YouTube? Today I want to talk about something very important for a lot of guitarists and that I also consider all the time, is how do you choose guitar strings? And I'm going to talk a little bit about all the different things you need to consider when you are choosing guitar strings. So what are some things you want to consider when you're trying to get strings? So the thing you want to consider is the gauge, so that's the thickness. You want to consider the material that the strings are made out of, or sometimes it's more than one material, sometimes it's two, sometimes it's even three. Another thing you want to consider is the kind of music you will be playing. That's super relevant because not all strings will sound the same for different music, or really they're not all gonna sound correct or right, or they're not gonna feel right. So there's so many different things that go into choosing strings. I mean, you'd think, oh, it's just a bunch, it's just wire, oh, what difference does it make? But trust me, it makes all the difference. So, you're probably considering some new strings. Maybe it's time for you to change guitar strings because you've had them on your guitar for a year and they're kind of starting to look like there's another life form living on there, right? You want to consider new strings. So one thing you want to consider is gauge, right? So the gauge plays a vital role because the thicker the gauge, so the bigger the numbers of the string, the more tension that they have on the string and therefore on the whole guitar. So then the more tension you have, the more the strings are pulling the separate parts of the guitar. So if you put on the way you have your guitar right now, hopefully set up, right? So everything plays the way you like it. If you choose the same string gauge, which is what I typically like to do, I like to keep it in the same string gauge, everything will remain pretty stable. If you decide to change the string gauge, it's gonna affect the guitar in a variety of ways. So if you have a thicker gauge, that means the strings are gonna pull harder. Basically, the neck is gonna start to bow. That's gonna affect action of your guitar. It's gonna feel like a different guitar. It's also gonna have a different tone. I mean, gauge is also gonna affect the sustain, the way the strings feel, how hard it is to bend. If you're bending your strings a lot, you might want to choose a slightly lighter string gauge. And another thing is, if you choose a gauge that's lighter, you will also still need to adjust the truss rod as if you were choosing a bigger gauge. You suddenly have less tension on the strings and the neck is now pulling the other way because there's something called a truss rod inside of the guitar. So you might want to think about that when you're choosing new strings. Another thing that happens with choosing different gauge is sometimes you choose too big of a gauge. The strings no longer fit in the slots. Also, when you change string gauges, you have to adjust the intonation. So try to stick to the same gauge if you can. If you don't know, ask someone who might be able to advise you. You want to consider what kind of music you're playing, because if you're playing metal, you might not necessarily want to use classical guitar strings, right? First of all, that's probably a little bit unlikely that you'll be able to put classical guitar strings onto an electric guitar, because if you have pickups and you have nylon strings, you're simply not gonna have any sound coming through your pickups, or if you do, it's gonna sound like something's off. I've never tried it, so if you have, let me know in the comments below, because I don't even know what that sounds like. So you want to consider what kind of music you'll be playing. If you're playing jazz, if you're playing rock, if you're playing acoustic, if you're playing classical, any kind of music you're playing, there's probably a string type that works better for your kind of music. I typically just use good old nickel wound strings with my electric guitars because it's kind of in the middle of the road, and they're typically excellent for like rock, blues, and you can even play jazz with them, you can play metal with them. It doesn't really, it gets a lot of tones out there. What I advise you to look out for is not to put on acoustic strings onto electric guitars. They will work, but typically something happens where you won't have the same kind of flexibility. It has a lot to do with the fact that you are using bronze strings and not nickel strings. So it offers too much resistance. It doesn't have the same feel, and it doesn't sound right too, right? Feel free to experiment. I mean, who am I to tell you that you can't experiment? Now, I want to talk a little bit about material, right? I have here a bunch of strings. I have a variety of instruments. I have my phosphor bronze Diodario, I have my Hanabach for my classical, I have my silken steel for my gypsy jazz, and then I have these half rounds, which are half flat. So these are for jazz, right? For jazz electric guitar. These are wonderful. They have a wound G. I'm a big fan of these, how they sound on acoustics. These are for acoustic instruments. These are for classical, so these are nylon. And then these are bronze. Unfortunately, I don't have any nickel strings right now. There's so many options, and you want to consider all of them. If you're just learning, or if you've been playing for a long time, sometimes you just want to experiment, or sometimes you're finding that what you have on your instrument right now is really it's not giving you the tone or the action or the feel you want. So it could be the strings, you know. I would say try some different strings. I always have Diodario nickel on my electric guitars. Final thing you want to consider is the brand. It has perhaps less of an effect on the tone, but it also does have an effect, and you'll find which strings work best for you. I have a couple of different brands I like, and I typically just purchase those brands, right? So there's really a lot of different options to go. I want to say try them all if you can, you know. They're usually not very expensive. Electric guitar strings or acoustic and classical guitar strings, they're not expensive compared to, let's say, violins or double basses, where just one string is $20, $30, $40, $50, right? A whole set is $200, so we really have it good compared to a lot of the other instruments out there. Be sure to check them out. You know, sometimes I've used elixirs in the past. They have that cool coating, and they just resonate in a way that right now I use different brands. So I'm not telling you which brand you should get. I'm not in no way sponsored by Diodario or by Martin. You know, check them out. There's really hundreds of options, you know, and mix and match. Some people even take their strings and they make their own custom gauges. You can buy singles and you can create your own custom gauge combinations, or you can just take it however you want. Just keep in mind that anytime you change strings and material and gauges, you will probably need to adjust your guitar in some way, whether with the truss rod action or something at the nut or at the saddle, or perhaps even the pickup height might need to be adjusted. When you start changing things up, one factor is gonna affect another thing, right? So you just want to be mindful of that. And if you don't know what you're doing, speak to someone who does. You could potentially damage your instrument. Enjoy and experiment, because I think that's part of the music, you know. Just all right, thanks for tuning in. As always, subscribe, ring the bell, like, and comment below. Let me know what other videos you want to see. I'll see you soon.